Only no oath required.
Yes, sir.
Reported from the Committee for Courts of Justice.
Senator from Rockingham.
Mr. President, I move that the bill pass. Speaking to the bill, Mr. President, this bill simply removes the oath requirement that is currently in law and is required of a minister or other person who seeks authorization to perform the rites of marriage.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Roanoke City, Senator Edwards.
Mr. President, I don't know how many more bills we're going to have dealing with the Supreme Court's decision authorizing same-sex marriages, but here's another one in another version. Mr. President, we've discussed the fact that ministers are not required to perform a religious service if it violates their religious tenets. That's because of the First Amendment. On the other hand, people who are not performing a religious service, but rather a civil ceremony to perform a marriage, are in a different posture. They're required to follow the Constitution of the United States of America, as interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court. What this bill does is simply say, well, if they don't take, it says they don't have to take an oath to perform their duties. Well, I guess that's to say didn't swear to follow the Constitution when I'm performing my duties as an official of the state to perform if it happens to be a civil ceremony. Again, they're protected if it's a religious ceremony, but if it's a civil ceremony, they're an actor of the state. And the second thing it does is try to say that no such person is considered an officer of the Commonwealth. Well, I'm not sure what they mean by officer, but they certainly are acting on behalf of the state because only the state can authorize a person to perform a civil ceremony to perform a marriage. So, Mr. President, this bill, I would hope we don't have any more of these kinds of bills trying to get around the Supreme Court's decision. We know what happened in Kentucky with the clerk of court, Kim Davis. She said it's against my religion to issue marriage licenses in same-sex marriage situations, and the judge made it very clear. She had to follow the law. She had to follow the Constitution. If she wasn't going to do it, he locked her up. And, Mr. President, I would hope we would not continue going down this line, and I hope we would reject this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. The junior senator from Loudoun, Senator Wexton.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking against the bill.
Senator has the floor.
I do feel it's important to note that a lot of folks who probably are going to vote in favor of this bill are the very first ones who were calling for the impeachment of our current Attorney General when he refused to continue on an unconstitutional course for the Commonwealth of Virginia with regard to same-sex marriage. This bill, I would associate myself with the remarks from the senator from Roanoke and just point out that these are folks who are acting under color of state law. They are performing a state function. And to carve out those civil celebrants who perform marriage ceremonies require that they not be required to take an oath to uphold the law and the Constitution is unprecedented, and I would ask the body to vote against this bill.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Rockingham, Senator Obenshain.
Mr. President, speaking of the bill, I find this debate fascinating and really quite disturbing in a couple of ways. First of all, the suggestion that if a minister is authorized to perform marriages, that if they're Southern Baptists, they ought to be required to perform civil gay marriages, is preposterous. And we sat in committee and talked about this issue, and it was agreed that the Constitution doesn't require that. And we acknowledge the diversity among our religious institutions on this issue. And this isn't anti-anything. This is simply protecting the First Amendment rights and the rights of association of different religious bodies. And it was pointed out that this is consistent with constitutional principles currently in law. And as a result, you look at the vote, I think that there was broad bipartisan agreement that we never intended to require every celebrant, every minister to conduct every ceremony. Now, we certainly have a Supreme Court ruling and we have laws and requirements that require the issuance of licenses, the recognition of gay marriages, and this doesn't change that in any way. It doesn't address it in any way, nor is it intended to address it in any way. So the suggestion that we ought to be throwing Baptist ministers in jail, I find preposterous. This was intended to protect the First Amendment rights of those Baptist ministers, and the rights of other people who wish to celebrate marriage are going to be protected. This doesn't undermine that. It doesn't undermine that.
Mr.
It
President.
simply provides that a Baptist minister can conduct whatever marriage ceremonies is consistent with his denominational beliefs.
Mr. President,
From Roanoke City, Senator
will the
Edwards.
senator from Harrisonburg yield for a question?
Would the senator from Rockingham yield for a
Rockingham.
I yield.
Sorry.
question? Yield, Senator.
Mr. President, will the senator agree that part of this, paragraphs 23 through 30, lines 22 through 33, deal with persons other than ministers who may perform rites? That is, the judge may authorize a person to perform a civil ceremony, someone who's not a minister. And that's what we're talking about here. Would the senator agree that this bill includes those people?
Senator from Rockingham.
Mr. President, I do agree with that. However, this in no way diminishes the ability of people to get married no matter what their sexual orientation is. It simply provides that a celebrant can make his or her determination as to which marriages they wish to conduct.
Mr. President,
Senator from Bath
would the
County.
gentleman yield for a question?
Would the senator from Rockingham yield for an additional question?
I yield.
He yields, Senator.
And the gentleman would agree with me that there's nothing in state or federal law that requires a religious figure, a pastor of any church, to conduct any marriage that he or she doesn't agree with.
Senator from Rockingham.
Mr. President, I would agree with that. However, I acknowledge that there were remarks made here on the floor just 5 minutes ago suggesting that people who refuse to perform marriages, certain marriages, ought to go to jail. And the reason for this bill is that there are people who actually believe that.
Mr.
And
President.
as a result, it is important to make sure that the provisions of the statute make it clear that it is in conformity and is consistent with the requirements of the Constitution.
Mr. President,
from Bath.
would the gentleman yield for an additional question?
Gentleman yield for an additional question.
Well,
I yield.
He yields, Senator.
The gentleman would further agree with me that there are lots of things said on the floor of this Senate that aren't worth the ink that it would take to print them, and that we shouldn't base all our actions on the hyperbole that comes from this floor or comes from any debate.
Senator from Rockingham.
Mr. President, well, I suppose that the senator is suggesting that this bill does no harm, so as a consequence, I would renew my motion that it pass.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Fairfax City, Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak in support of the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, you know, I've been watching this discussion over the past few weeks as someone who attends a church, and I've always been under the impression that when you're a minister, you marry people according to the dictates of your professed religion. And this section, 20-23 through 20-25, deals with non-public people. It's not the clerk of court. This is not Kim Davis, so that's a very poor analogy. These are people that either are ministers to a church or persons other than a minister that may perform rites within their church, or it's people that simply came in and want to officiate at a marriage, and they do so probably for a friend or you know, maybe to fill in where there's a situation that they're needed. Okay, these are not public officials. These are not people that ran on a ballot and put themselves out there and are in charge of applying our laws. And the bottom line is, are we suddenly going to put people in jail or hold them civilly liable because they say, well, I didn't take this oath and agree to perform marriages so I could do every single marriage under the sun. I only wanted to do my friend's marriage or a marriage within my church. And, you know, this bill is the best argument against it. It's not necessary, but unfortunately some of the rhetoric I hear is, well, gosh, if you don't perform all marriages, then you ought to be punished because you're a bad person. And, like I said, I've been very quiet as these debates have transpired, but I'm very uncomfortable with some of the rhetoric, frankly, coming from my side of the aisle. So maybe this bill is more necessary than I thought a few weeks ago. All it says is that if you're not a public official and you simply come forward voluntarily to officiate marriages, you don't become an officer of the state, you don't have to turn in people, and you're not subject to civil or criminal punishment based on those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Buckingham, Senator Garrett.
Speaking briefly to the bill, there's a parallel here, Mr. President. That would be the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 that says that if it is part of your religion, you may use peyote, right? And so if anybody else does it, it's illegal. If a state actor were to do something, it would be illegal. But in this instance, the Establishment Clause was respected, and we passed a federal law saying it was okay to use a Schedule I controlled substance. And here, too, we're talking about private individuals with a religious objection. If one's okay, why not the other? I think there's an incredible double standard that's applied in one portion of this room, whereas I think a little bit of uniformity would be good for justice and equity across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Alexandria, Senator Eben.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking briefly to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Just a clarification about 20-25 and what a civil celebrant is. I, for example, am performing a marriage for a good friend and his girlfriend or fiance later this year. And I'll take an oath to follow the procedures of the state. That's not the part I'm most concerned about in 20-25. What I'm concerned about is these people who the judges designate for anyone who wants to have a marriage in their locality. If you go to the website for some of the localities in my district, you'll find that they recommend people for civil marriages. And I spoke to one of them a few weeks ago who said this was a bad idea. And what you could end up with is in some localities, you could find if there's two people designated and they didn't like the idea of marrying certain kinds of people, that they wouldn't. And when you take an oath, it doesn't say here that you're taking an oath to marry every person who's authorized in your church or for a religious person to do that. I haven't taken the oath yet, but my understanding is that I would take an oath to uphold the law in terms of how you perform a marriage. So I don't see there being any problem right now. There's never been a Catholic priest in Virginia who's been forced to marry a divorced person, never been a rabbi forced to marry a interfaith couple. And this is just more efforts to work our way around the Supreme Court. With that, I ask that you vote against the bill.
Thank you, Senator. The question is, shall House Bill 19 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their votes aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their votes? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 22, noes 16.
Ayes 22, noes 16, the bill passes.